friends. I was trying to get the word out because, as you know, every morning when you open the newspaper, there's an article about affordable housing from one direction or another. It's a very difficult topic. It's a fun topic. There's lots of solutions and lots of problems. So tonight we're going to get all the answers from this wonderful panel of people that Michael put together. Michael Ackerlow is the new director of the Community Development Corporation, and he'll tell you what that means. And ask your questions. We'll be passing those out. If you write a question down that gets covered during the meeting, we probably won't ask it again, because the idea is to try to get out as much information as we can. We are filming the meeting, so in a couple of weeks this will appear on our website, and at that point I'll let you know, and you can send it to your friends and maybe other community councils or the city council, whoever needs to know about this stuff. Okay? So we're going to do 60 minutes, and then we have 30 minutes for questions and answers.
Good evening, everyone. It's nice to be here. As Judy said, my name is Mike Ackerlow, and I'll be the moderator for tonight's panel. I am a recovering flu victim. So I'm not contagious, so you don't have to worry about that. The doctor said I'm not contagious, but I do have a bad cough, so every so often I may drink some water or have a coughing fit or something. Tonight, I want to give a brief introduction to our topic and then introduce our panelists, who are all experienced in this topic. We're going to have a discussion about one of the most pressing yet complicated issues that is facing our community: affordable housing. Over the past few years, this has become one of the most discussed issues on a local, state, and national level. It is affecting all communities. Since the Great Recession, home values have increased at a rapid pace, exceeding those of pre-recession levels. Land values have also increased, further driving up prices. However, wages have not increased, have not kept up with those increasing housing prices, and so too many of our public are cost burdened or severely cost burdened, and we can talk more about what that means later. And they are not able to find housing that fits within their budgets. Therefore, they're spending too much of their income on housing costs, preventing them from having access to other essential items such as good food, healthcare, transportation, recreation, and other items. Stabilized housing, or housing that is affordable, is the key to a healthy community, in addition to personal health. It's a way to grow community wealth and personal wealth. Studies show that being cost burdened leads to other societal concerns, such as higher crime rates, higher teen pregnancy rates, lower graduation rates, and poor mental and physical health. So if we try to focus on affordable housing as a solution, we could see an improvement in a lot of other areas in our communities. As I mentioned, tonight we have three very experienced panelists who are going to help us understand this crisis. Who needs the housing? And what is affordable housing? Where is it needed? Why can't we get it? Why is it so expensive to build? So I'm going to introduce myself first, and then I'll briefly introduce our other panelists. I am the new CEO of the Community Development Corporation of Utah. It's a nonprofit that is focused on home ownership opportunities for those with low and moderately low incomes. I came from a real estate family. I grew up in a home with a father who was a real estate developer, and I was in private real estate development until the recession. I got a master's in real estate development from Columbia University in 2000, came back and thought I was going to take on the world, and then the recession hit. And so I looked for some stability and went to the city and started in economic development there. Over time, moved into housing and neighborhood development, served as the director for there a little while, and then became the deputy director of the Department of Community and Neighborhoods. I left back in November to become the CEO of CDC Utah, and I'm really enjoying my time there and looking forward to increasing home ownership and housing stability to more Utahns. Melissa Jensen, right there in the middle, and you don't have to guess which one she is because she's the only female up here, unless other ones have Melissa as a first name, has worked in the community development field for over 10 years. She developed a passion for helping her community at a very young age and pursued a master's degree in social work in order to learn how to become a catalyst for change in her career. She brings a wide range of work experience ranging from the nonprofit and private sector, and currently works in the public sector as the Director of Housing and Neighborhood Development for Salt Lake City. In this capacity, she oversees the city's real estate, federal funding, capital improvement program, affordable housing initiatives and development, and capital asset management. She is driven by impact and always looking for ways to increase that impact in Salt Lake City neighborhoods. To my left is Nick Norris. He is a native of Salt Lake City and the planning director for Salt Lake City. He is passionate about the city and is motivated to improve the quality of life for all its citizens. Working closely with the community, other city departments, the mayor, and city council, Nick helps people find workable solutions to the land issues facing the city. He is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. He can often be found in the outdoors, running the trails in the foothills, biking up City Creek Canyon, or skiing in the backcountry. Nick graduated from the University of Utah and has been involved in urban planning since 2001. And then finally, on my far left is Chris Parker. Chris has an abiding passion for helping places renew. This interest has gradually progressed from buildings to blocks to catalytic neighborhood redevelopments like the Imagine Jefferson, Startup Crossing, and Open Projects. As director of Give Group, he's overseen the successful completion of over 500 units of low and mixed income housing and is scheduled to break ground on another 500 this year. He hopes to continue helping Utah communities regrow and stabilize throughout his career. So we welcome this great staff, and I think one of the good things for us tonight is these are experienced, seasoned individuals who have a depth of knowledge. And so I will try to cover as much as I can throughout our questions, but I'm sure you're going to have many more, so we'll take some time at the end to turn over to you and to ask your questions about affordable housing and community development. I'm going to start by asking Melissa to give us some context. When we talk about affordable housing, what does that mean? What is affordable, and who needs this housing?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here. Yes, that is such an easy question to answer. I'm so glad you asked it. I think at the most basic term or definition of affordable housing, we really like to think of it as no person should really be paying more than 30% of their income toward their housing. What we know about Salt Lake City in particular is that the majority of our houses are cost burdened, which really just means that they're paying more than 30% of their housing. Of their paycheck toward their housing. I think a more glaring statistic as we think about what is affordable and what isn't is 1 in 4 residents pays more than 50% of their income towards housing, which means if you're making $30,000 a year, which many, many people are, you're paying over $15,000 of that, which doesn't leave a lot for the shoes for your kids or school fees or books or medical care or groceries or to spend in your local business. So I think that gives a little scope of sort of the issue. I think as we think about affordability broadly, I often like to make a distinction about what I'm talking about. Many of you in this room have an apartment complex or a triplex or a duplex or some version of that in your neighborhood that maybe isn't run well, that you don't know what they're doing, and you're calling the city on them all the time because they aren't shoveling their walks or keeping up their properties, and we need that information, and you're good neighbors to keep us informed of that. That is not affordable housing generally. And I think sometimes in communities there's a lot of misconception about what affordable housing looks like and feels like. And when we speak about affordability, we really are thinking about units that are well cared for, well managed, and add to the community. And they're done, and we do that through formalized processes. So when we really talk about how we add affordability, we're talking about adding assets to communities, not poorly run units that are not taken care of. And it's a real distinction because there's some parts of the city, frankly, that have substandard housing. And people who are low income are living there because they have nowhere else to go. But that's not what we like to talk about when we envision adding affordability to our community. And so I think that's just an important thing as we think about what is it. It's what you'll hear from Chris about what he builds. It's housing with programming. It's housing that's well kept, well designed. Who needs it? Well, everybody needs it. I was asked the other day by a reporter, well, how much is enough? And I remember saying, gosh, if we could do 20 or 30%, that would be great. But as I've reflected, I wish that I would have said, no amount is enough until every person has stable housing. And that is really the core of what we do, because it's not about the unit that we build, it's about the life that we're offering somebody with affordable housing. And so when we think about who needs it, every single person needs it. In fact, I'm constantly amazed at the resilience of our community that we don't have more people living on the streets, because it takes quite a bit to figure out how to pay rent, on a $15,000 a year income. So I'm thinking about that constantly, and just to give you a number that we use a lot, what we know specifically is that there's about 7,500 residents in Salt Lake City that, like, our gap for affordability is about 7,500 units for this population that's making about $20,000 or less. So that's a pretty big goal to work towards. And the struggle that each person has, each one of those 7,500 people, to keep a roof over their head is pretty daunting, but something that we're really committed to working towards. So I hope that gives us sense to kind of start the conversation.
Melissa, as a follow-up to that, and other panelists, please join in if you feel so inclined. I think back to your comments about the misperceptions of affordable housing. Oftentimes we see in communities that they're afraid of it, of what it might bring, what they think it might bring to their communities, to their neighborhoods. So tell us a little bit about the people. Who are these people?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Who are in that 7,500 or even above that? Who are the working class, or we call them working wage? Tell us about who are these people?
Yeah.
Let's make it real.
Thanks for asking that. Because I'm among friends here, and I'm not the only woman in the room, so this is fantastic. I'm surrounded by wonderful women here. So on a personal level, my mom needs affordable housing. She didn't work through her life. She was very sick and never earned a wage, and so now she's elderly and doesn't have a place to live on a very low income. And my brother also needs affordable housing. We grew up in a really poor family, and so he has worked for UPS for many years. And UPS is a great company, and if you work there long enough, you'll get a living wage. But let me tell you, the 15 years that it takes to get a living wage is a pretty big sacrifice. And so he's done that. It's daycare workers. It's people that you smile at every day when you drop your grandkids or your kids off. And it's hospitality workers, people that are cleaning the hotels. And it's administration and waste workers, your garbage men that clean up, and your street cleaners. And all of those folks, it's apprenticeship programs, people who are learning how to be plumbers and electricians. So a lot of it is just people starting out that need some help to get stable, but oftentimes crisis slides them out of that ability and they have to start all over again.
I think it's interesting as you've talked to people in the community, sometimes when you personalize it a little bit, saying when your son or daughter graduates from college, they're going to need affordable housing. And sometimes when that happens, the light goes on, and oh yeah, everybody needs us. It's my son and my daughter. It's me. It's everybody. So good point. Let's talk about Salt Lake City itself. When you drive through the city, you see, and this is for anyone on the panel, you see a lot of construction going on. There's a lot of apartments that have been built over the last number of years. And Nick probably can give us a number, or a round guess, on the number of units that have been built in our city. So if we see all those new units coming up, why are we in this crisis?
I won't answer the why, but so just to give people an idea, in 2017, we, in talking total number of new housing units, just in Salt Lake City alone, so not even going into our neighboring cities or the county or neighboring counties, there were, I can't remember the exact number, but there were more than 9,000 housing units that were either in 2017 that opened, were under construction, had been permitted, meaning they're in the permit process, or approved by our Planning Commission or Landmarks Commission. To give you an idea of what that means historically, the largest decade of housing growth that we had in Salt Lake City was between 1950 and 1960, where in that decade we built 12,000 housing units in our city. So housing generally is a multi-year, and Chris can comment on this too, kind of process. You go from the concept to designing to permitting to building and then finally opening up. It takes a couple of years for that. So we are kind of in the heart of this development, of this unprecedented housing growth in the city. And what it means really is that we're trying to catch up. And so when you think about that, from 1990 to 2005, I think that we had something like 1,100 units of new housing built in Salt Lake City. So over a 15-year period, we just didn't see it. Most of that was in one development. So that gives you an idea of what we've been trying to respond to. Part of that is because we did go from 1960 to the mid-90s. We saw population decline in Salt Lake City. People were moving out of the suburbs. Their household sizes were getting smaller. In the mid-90s, that started to change, and we're back up to where our population was in 1960. The 2010 census, we basically were exactly the same spot we were in 1960 from the population, but we went down a 25,000 person drop over that period of time. What happened is we lost a lot of housing units. And so during those times, they just went away. Either they were demolished, they were converted, whatever. We lost a lot of housing units during that period of time. And so the other kind of interesting thing that happened in the mid-90s is that the city rezoned the entire city. At the time, we allowed, at the very least, you could have a duplex on any property in the city if you had enough land area. And if you drive through our neighborhood, you'll see duplexes, small apartments, and that is how we grew as a city from the time that we were initially settled from the Plat of Zion, and how those plats were divided up basically to provide more housing. And so you'd have multiple units on a lot. It'd be multiple homes, there'd be alley homes, which we still have a few of those that have managed to survive, to the smaller scale, that incremental kind of growth types of things, because that's what people at the time could afford to build, was just that next level up. They could start with a single family home, and then we can get a second unit. We can build a triplex or 4-unit apartment building, and that's what you'd start to see change. And so we had all of that. That was our growth pattern as a city, and then in '95, all of that changed. And it became harder and harder. A lot of it was responding to market forces and community demands, but it became harder and harder to build housing in Salt Lake City. Roughly 10 or 15 years ago, we started to, as a city, make a number of zoning changes to remove some of those barriers, particularly in our downtown and some of our business districts. Probably, and I think Judy could probably comment on this too a little bit, is, in Sugar House, the city rezoned that 15 years ago, and it took a long time for anything to change really in Sugar House. And so it might have even been more than that. It might have been actually way back in the mid-90s where the zoning changed too. And so it takes what we want to do from our perspective is is set the development framework, get those zoning regulations in place so that the market can respond, which is something we haven't had, and frankly, most cities in the United States haven't had that. And so we're not unique. We're going through the same thing that every urban area in the country either has gone through or is going through right now. So we're not unique in that regard. And so the good thing about that is a lot of people have gone down this path before, and we can learn from those places to try to make it so that we can promote more housing in the right places.
So Nick, you've talked a lot, the zoning is an issue, and the change has made it harder to build, excuse me, a mix of housing types in our city. Melissa, recently the city adopted the new housing plan, Growing SLC, and in there you identify some impediments, some barriers to housing. What are those? Tell us what the issues are. Nick's mentioned zoning, which is one of the first objectives in your housing plan, to address the zoning issues. What else? What other impediments are there to bringing more affordable housing to our market?
Yeah, I think just to add to what Nick was saying, I think that we need to, the zoning's going to help a couple of things, and housing type is a big one. When we think about increase in housing, it's not just 200 unit or 300 unit complexes. We need a balance for communities so that what's built fits, right? And so the zoning is a big, big issue. The other piece that's huge is funding, frankly. When you're talking about the cost of housing, and right now we're seeing for a new studio or one bedroom, $1,100 for rent a month. I mean, you might say that's a mortgage if you could then find a house to buy, right? So good luck. And so there's a real demand issue and a funding issue. So when we think about wages not increasing, what that means is that literally it doesn't matter. You'd have to work 2.5 minimum wage jobs to even begin to afford a rental unit here. And traditional funding sources have been a huge tool in poverty mitigation, frankly. Vouchers, as you might know, where it helps subsidize rent for somebody who's making a really low income or is on a fixed income, is one of the largest anti-poverty programs in the country. And there's not enough of them. You can't get them, frankly. You're going to wait 5 years. And so really looking at how to fund affordability long-term is probably the second largest. And then I think there's really an issue of equity and boundaries and where this goes to some of the not in my backyard issues where people have misperceptions about who affordable housing is or what it does to a community. And so we meet a lot of resistance, and that can be a very big barrier, especially when data shows that kids who live in areas of opportunity, as we call them, or areas that are rich in education and healthcare and food access and transportation, their income actually increases over their lifetime, statistically. And so when you can begin to create communities that are based in diversity, there's a lot of power, but the barrier to that is really helping our communities understand what that is and looks and feels like. And that is a big challenge.
So Chris. Chris is an amazing developer and has done a lot of good work throughout our state. I really view you and your company as more of a community developer rather than just a typical housing developer. So I want to start out, I'm going to give you a big, long question. I want you, first of all, to tell us about GIVE. Tell us about what you do, your missions, your mission and your values, and then address these impediments, these barriers. What makes it hard for you to develop more affordable housing? How have you managed to do it? So you got about 20 minutes.
Yeah, so my name is Chris. I work with a group called GIVE. We basically do two things. We go into blighted and transitional neighborhoods that were kind of very vibrant and vital back in their yesteryear, and we try to figure out ways where they might regain a little bit of that swagger. And then we go into areas that are about to gentrify and try to make it so that when the coffee shops and the vegan restaurants come, that everybody gets to partake in those, not just the people who come with those sort of things. And in so doing, we kind of realize the importance of housing in sort of that work. I mean, if you're going to improve a neighborhood and you're ultimately going to raise overall property values and quality of life, decrease crime, all the things you want in a neighborhood, you have to figure out a way where you're not the force that kicks out the people who need those sort of things the most while you're doing it. And so we became very interested in housing 5 or 6 years ago. Looked around a lot in the Rockies at different places that we thought might be a fun place to start. Settled on Ogden, did our second project in Salt Lake, and then one down in what's now called the Startup District of Provo. And have kind of settled in on mainly Salt Lake for the next few years. I think we'd like to work in. So yeah, I mean, we think a lot about housing. A lot of our crew have done various kind of research projects trying to figure out exactly what life on minimum wage is like and how you might raise the overall quality of someone's life on that wage. And the reality is, if you don't have a stable place to sleep at night, you're not thinking about anything else, especially if you have kids. You need some space to de-stress, to think about tomorrow in order to have a better tomorrow. And you just don't have that if you don't know where you're staying, or if where you're staying has water dripping on your head or is infested or something like that. So we build mixed income housing. We found that it's better for both sides of the equation if you include that. I think there was a perception, with some people that having affordability in your neighborhood or even in your building might be something that's a negative influence. We found exactly the opposite. In our first project in Ogden, we had an area that right after the recession is when we started. And we went ahead and built a primarily affordable housing complex. It was about 80 units, had some retail on the bottom, 20% market. And what was interesting is the whole area was about a 30-block neighborhood improved over the 2 quarters after our project opened, and kind of the 2 years prior by about 30% economically during this course, which is good. But the reality is everywhere improved. It was right after the recession. But within a 1-block halo of our building, it improved by 110% property value over the same course. If you build quality places to live and fill them with quality people of any income, your neighborhood improves. And I think as far as barriers that we've had to overcome, I think there's this perception that affordable housing brings all of these negative attributes, and we've found none of that whatsoever. We found actually that when you have people that are able to support business living next to the businesses, when you're able to have kind of this mix of personalities and incomes within the same general space, that everybody just has a far better sense of kind of what it is like to live well in this city. So as far as barriers, I think there's the perception issue. Nobody wants this where they live, or at least that's traditionally been the mantra. Our success is a huge barrier. Salt Lake, Utah generally, is a really desirable place to live, both organically. Demographically, we're 2 types of people here in Utah, with huge exceptions, of course, but we're white Mormons and Hispanic Catholics, and so we have a lot of natural growth. And we've become a destination, really. I mean, our financial sector, our technology sector, we have a very powerful workforce, and some of the negative stereotypes that Utah might have had in the 70s and 80s have melted away, and people are realizing what a great place this is to live. And so what you have is 9,000 units getting built and still vacancy rates at 1% and 2%. And while that's a great problem to have, because it means a lot of these well-paying jobs are coming to town, Starbucks or McDonald's is not paying more when everyone starts coming in. And so a house that used to be someone right out of college, or someone starting a family competing for, now someone working for Goldman Sachs or American Express is now competing for that same house, and you have a raise in general property values and rent levels, which is great if you can build to keep up with it. But the problem is you can't, because we came off a recession, and during the recession, nothing got built. And so your entire contractor class, your subs, your generals, all of them laid off. And a lot of those people went away. They decided, I'm not going into construction, this is too cyclical, I'm out. And then right on the heels of everyone deciding they don't want to do construction, you have the largest housing boom Salt Lake's seen ever. And so you're seeing the cost of construction, because we don't have enough workers, go up dramatically. For the type of product we build over the last 24 months, the cost to build a one-bedroom unit has gone up 25%. And so here you have dramatic need, and you have less and less capacity to build it. And that leads to where we are now. I don't want to take the whole 20 minutes, so
All right. Okay.
I could go on that for a while. But there's a lot of factors that are kind of making this a real decision for us as people of Utah, honestly, because I think this is the most pressing land use issue of our time. If we don't house people, every other negative aspect in life follows. You cannot have a successful life without a place to live. And so it's something we've got to spend a lot of time on.
And I would just say we're focusing a lot on rental housing development, but to Chris's point, the spectrum is as such that if you can't rent an apartment from an apartment building or a duplex, it's really pushed that sector into single family as well. So we have a ton of single family homes that instead of going up for sale are being rented out because it's lucrative, there's demand there, and there's market there. And so then that also has pushed the prices for home ownership, because you can't hardly find a home. And there used to be a perception that millennials didn't want to purchase homes, but that's not true. They just can't. They don't have the down payment, and so they're putting it off longer. And even when they want to buy a home, they can't find something in their price range. And so it really compounds from people that are homeless to people wanting their first home. And so it bleeds into everywhere. And I mean, you could even then talk about the sectors of, like Airbnb and VRBO. And so the demand is more, can be a problem and a good thing as well.
To color that a little bit, 12 years ago, the median income versus the median home price was 2 to 1. So twice the median income was what an average home would be. This year it was 4 to 1 over a 10-year period. It was the third strongest growth in the nation of appreciation for home values. Now, Salt Lake was was very low for the nation prior, so we had a little bit of room in between those two. But if you take that trend even 10 years more, we're going to have a real problem for middle income people. I mean, forget people that are making, $7 to $10 an hour and trying to bend mathematics in order to live a life. This is going to be a problem for anyone making $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. And because we have such an in-migration of very high earners. I mean, it's a great thing, but when you only have a very limited housing stock and you have a bunch of people with a lot of newfound money coming in, house prices go up.
Chris, I want to, if you'll just take us a couple more minutes, and will you give us a little more detail about some of the projects you've built? Because I think they're really creative, and maybe you finance them using government, tax credits, which I want to have Melissa talk a little more about financing here in a moment. But just, I would love the audience to hear about some of the actual work you're doing, because it's really impactful, and the mix of incomes and the services that are available, and how you believe that'll change people's lives.
So a lot of people might have heard of a study that came out about 6 years ago. It got a lot of press that talked about the level of income you need to have a happy life, whereby if you make an extra dollar, it wouldn't actually make your life better. So their magic number 6 years ago was $75,000 for the U.S. and about $70,000 for Utah. That's since gone up. And so we start looking at, one way that you could try to get everybody this kind of American idea of having a good shot at pursuing happiness might be to try to find a way where everybody gets up to $75,000, which is hard in the best of times. But the reality is we're staring down the barrel of low and middle income jobs, probably dramatically decreasing over the next 20 years. Most of the studies on the matter look at between 40 and 70% of blue-collar service sector work being replaced by automation and artificial intelligence within the next 10 years. And you can kind of see this, right? I mean, Elon Musk has a announcement where he's going to bring us new semi trucks, and he's going to save a lot of money on shipping, which is great. The cost of goods go down. How he's going to do it, though, is he's going to make one driver for 3 trucks, and eventually that driver is going to go away too. Amazon, like 4 weeks ago, and rolled out their first grocery store that doesn't have any checkers in it. You just select things off the wall, and you walk out, and it knows what's in your bag and charges your card. Again, great thing, brings down the cost of groceries potentially, not so great if you're a checker. So the idea of getting everyone up to 75 would have been tough. It's going to be extremely tough over the next 10 years. So you start thinking about, well, what is $75,000 really buying you? And how might you get those goods and services at 50? What does a life where you don't need anything else look like at 40 or 35 or $25,000? And so our projects, especially our recent projects, try to figure out how you might do that. So the project I live in was built 2 months ago, has, kind of manless grocery store in it that'll be going in. It has car sharing, electric vehicle car sharing that combines with transportation that allows people not to have to buy a car unless they want to. The second biggest thing most low-income families spend their money on is transportation, which is actually directly related to housing. As we push kind of reasonable rent further and further out to the perimeter, then the amount of transportation costs you have to get back to where you're supposed to work goes up. So really, transportation and housing are more or less the same thing. It's a net zero building. It's the first net zero building in Utah that costs less to build than a regular one, because air quality is deeply dependent on income as to how much it affects you. A lot of people drove here tonight, and you've got an air filter in the front of your car that protects you from what's coming out the back of it. If you can't afford a car and it's a red air day and you're walking to work, your throat's just going to hurt, or your kid's going to have asthma. And so we start looking at, how can you go ahead and create systemic ways of attacking something like our buildings polluting our air shed in a way that's replicable for the market, so that you're not just, wishing people would do better. You actually make demonstrations so that you can show them, hey, you can actually do this for the same cost as what you're doing now. I'm going to spend like 4 hours on this, so I'm going to stop.
Chris, your projects are impressive, and I personally have friends who've been able to move into those, into your units. They are cost burdened and low income, and I will tell you, being there has changed their lives. And so I want to thank you for your great work. But I think the thing that Chris helps out so much with is it's a bit of a different approach. And while Chris is a for-profit developer, he is a community-minded, personal growth minded person. He wants to see the best for people. And if we had more time, and maybe we will, I'd love to have Chris tell us a little about his experience of living on minimum wage for a year. And it was fascinating, because I know I'm embarrassing him, but he learned a lot from that experience and takes that and puts it into his development. We're going to hold questions just till the end.
It just was a word that felt like us. Doesn't stand for anything. I wish it did.
Melissa, well, let me go to Nick quickly. One of the items in the Salt Lake City's new housing plan is addressing zoning issues, and your master plans talk about, and you've mentioned this earlier, about growth in our city. We're going to see huge growth over the next 20 years, 40 years, and your plan is a way to accommodate that growth. It also addresses affordable housing and talks about creating an equitable place for people to live, that anybody can find a place to live in Salt Lake City. So you kind of talked about zoning at the beginning, and in some ways, the zoning of the past has really prevented or prohibited people with low incomes or unrestricted incomes from finding a place to live here. Let's talk about some solutions. So one of the solutions that has come up is, this is an interesting one, is inclusionary zoning. So maybe talk to the crowd here a little bit about what inclusionary zoning is, and what the pros and cons of having that in the community are.
Okay. So inclusionary zoning, for those that don't know, is basically zoning rules that require a certain number of if you're building housing, a certain number of those housing units that you're building has to be built for certain income levels so that they have housing that's affordable to them. So for example, if you build a 100-unit apartment building and the place has a inclusionary zoning requirement that 10% of those units have to be affordable, then you'd have to have at least 10 units in that building that are maintain affordable, usually for the period of whatever the federal loan program is that they're using to pay for the project. So I don't know what those terms are, 30, 40, 50 years or whatever they are. In a place like Salt Lake, so big cities have been trying this for a long time. I think the first inclusionary zoning regulations were in the 70s in big cities, Boston, New York City, mainly back east is where they started. And I think it's probably varying degrees of success. One of the things that some communities that have tried it have found is that when they are surrounded by other communities, and the housing just gets built right across the city border, who maybe that city doesn't have the inclusionary requirement. And so that city that passes it, that's trying to do the right thing, actually makes their issue worse because all the housing is being built someplace else. And so there's not actually housing in their city. That's essentially what happened with the rise of the suburbs. All the housing was being built outside of cities, and that's where everybody was going to. That's why we saw big shrinkage. I think probably Melissa can weigh in on a lot of her group has done a lot of research on inclusionary zoning, but I think the fact is it has a very mixed bag of results. Some places have said that they think it works okay. I don't know of a single city where they've found that it works great. There's some other cities that have tried different approaches to it. For example, not in the United States, but in Canada, in Toronto, they've tried to really focus they've been trying to adopt inclusionary zoning for a number of years and they can't do it, but they do have regulations about displacement. So if you're displacing existing housing, either upgrading it, which is one of those things that we see, the luxury housing trend that is going on, people taking older apartment buildings and investing a lot of money into them, but then marketing them to an entirely different income bracket. So they've tried different approaches there with some marginal success, I think. But it isn't a silver bullet solution, because it just, especially in a place like Salt Lake where we are surrounded by communities that are starting to experience similar types of housing issues through growth and things like that. And if we're too restrictive in the city, it means a lot of that housing is going to be outside of our city. Melissa, do you want to add on?
No, I think that was a really good description. I think the only thing I would add is that in Utah, we're compounded by a legislature that most likely would not support an inclusionary zoning ordinance. And additionally, the amount of resources, working for the city, you're always contemplating what is the best use of taxpayer resources for impact. And I think that's a really important question to always consider. So inclusionary zoning is very expensive to implement. And so you really have to weigh, what is the impact of this going to be? And are we going to reach that impact that we're hoping for the cost? And I think that's something that we haven't seen a good summary on in any city where they've said, yes, absolutely, all the compliance that you have to do and the watchfulness, and it's hitting the demographic that we want, and it's being done right. I mean, we haven't seen those components align after 30, 40 years. So we're skeptical about how that might look.
But it's in your plan, and it's something you want to investigate, and perhaps there could be some policy or ordinance that works. Have you any thoughts on what that might look like?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. I think when you're trying to solve a problem as complicated as affordable housing, you really have to vet all solutions. And what you see is that some pieces of solutions make sense where others don't. So for inclusionary zoning, for example, are there specific areas in the city that could really benefit from it? Do we do it by zone? Is there a way we contemplate zoning things? Where has it been most successful? And I think it's not good enough to say, well, the solution isn't perfect, so we're not going to do it, right? When you hear somebody like Chris talk about, like, this is somebody's life. So we owe it to our community to really vet and try everything that could make our residents more successful residents. And so I think that's where it comes down to, is even though it has mixed reviews, it's on me, and it's on our community, and it's on the mayor, and it's on people like Chris to say, we still have to try to find a solution that can make a difference.
As we did some of that research years ago on inclusionary zoning, we found that some cities would do a fee in lieu of developing the housing. There's pros and cons to that. I mean, obviously, if they're paying into a fund, that gives you more tools. It gives you access to capital that can then be put out into the community. But what can also happen is areas can decide, we don't want affordable housing here, and so we're going to put that money aside. And we'll give you the money because it's better for us just to give you the money than actually have the housing. And so there's pros and cons to it. And I think some developers also struggle with, hey, why are you forcing me to do this? And now that you're making me do this, I'll subsidize those lower income units by really increasing the rents on these other units. And now we're eliminating housing for perhaps the middle rents. So I think importantly, I think they really bring up some good points here. It's not a silver bullet. And there may be a form that works, but it's got to be maybe tried and then see what happens. Melissa, a little bit on financing. You brought that up earlier as one of the impediments. Take a moment and just explain to people how typical affordable housing finance works. And you're gonna have to do the short, like, this is pre-101. Let's talk about affordable housing finance, and then why is that an impediment? What's the problem? Why can't we get these units funded?
Yeah, so I think the best way to explain this, and Chris will jump in and hopefully help. There's affordable housing has been built for decades in communities all over the world through a tax credit program, which basically means that we can sell a tax credit, right? So we all do maybe charitable donations, or you write off your mortgage interest. So we sell that credit to banks and they can buy it. And that goes into a project, which means that many of our projects have a huge influx of cash go into them that helps subsidize the lower rents. Well, there isn't enough of those. So there's not enough equity or cash going into these projects to help support lower incomes. Well, let's be honest. I mean, building buildings is a risky business, and it takes a lot for developers to take that risk and to build it and to see it to fruition, and to do that with, a commitment to keep rents low, right? And so the tax credits are needed, but we haven't seen an increase in those in many years, and they continue to dwindle. And certainly under this administration, they were threatened this past year. As I spoke earlier, vouchers also are not doing the job. So if we depended on this resource to build all of our affordable housing, we'd get about 200 to maybe 300 units a year, which means we would absolutely never meet the need, ever. So I think that's really the heart of the crisis right now, is we have leveraged every resource, we have dug under every rock, we have tried every model to get more housing out there, but it's not enough. There has to be a different solution.
So a couple follow-ups. If you don't mind, we're in a room of voters, women voters, League of Women Voters right here. So the recent change in the tax law, how did that impact these tax credits? Because it matters, right?
Yeah, so we depend on people owing taxes to purchase these credits, because when they do, their tax liability goes down. So we used to be able to sell $1 for $1.25, which means we got all that extra money. Now we're going to sell that dollar for $1.10 or $1.08, which directly correlates to the amount of units that can be built. This is the probably best example of a public-private partnership. You have a nonprofit credits, helping do the work, and they sell it to a bank, and that bank gets a tax reduction, and affordable units are built with really long-term affordability. And so when that's threatened, what that means is they no longer need the tax credit. So the private piece is really decreasing its sort of, value in this market. And that's going to be a real struggle in the coming years, as we are not only needing to build more affordable housing, but affordable housing for those who are exiting homelessness. As you all know, shelters are being built and there aren't enough beds. And how are we going to make sure that folks have a house? It's very hard to exit out of homelessness if you have no place to go.
So second question, what is the city doing for solutions, for funding solutions? And let's broaden that a little bit. What other things could be done perhaps on a statewide level to help finance more affordable housing?
I think this is where we really can look nationally and see some very successful models. I think the problem with any federal program, whether it's tax credits or vouchers, is it becomes so restrictive that you have a hard time deploying those dollars into your community. So where we've seen real successes is with bonds and levies, and sales tax, frankly, which are all topics that are on the table, as you know. I think there was a bill released today or over the weekend for a $100 million bond. The state legislature. Thank you, Tara, for your work on that. And what that allows people to do, administrations, whether it's our city or other cities, because this is not a Salt Lake City problem. Every community needs affordable housing. And frankly, we would appreciate it if more communities did more affordable housing. And so certainly if you can advocate locally in communities where it's really not being addressed, that's helpful. And then what you can do with the funding, a bond or a levy, is then you really target those resources in a way that produces results. What does that mean? That's a lot of jargon. What that means is you do programs that function like a voucher, but it's related to economic sustainability. So you're actually helping people improve their economic status so that they could then not rely on a voucher or support. So you're allowed to target dollars in a more consistent manner to both incentivize developers and help people who need it. When we talk about 7,500 people needing housing, they're already here. They're the folks that can't sleep at night because they're thinking about the roof over their head. So how do we enhance their life through a long-term and sustainable funding source? So the city is looking at that. And they will be considering that as we go forward with the sales tax and bond. And I say go forward, I should be very clear, go forward into the vetting process to determine if that's a feasible solution for our community. The mayor's gonna be like, Melissa told a group of people that we're doing a bond. So feedback on that is really important, and affordable housing should be one of those top issues.
So really, when we talk about the financing here, this is a public issue and a public solution. The financing for affordable housing can come from some private sources, but really it's to help buy these credits. But when we talk about making these numbers work, you really are talking about subsidies. And I think that's probably a hard issue for some people to swallow, that I'm having to pay more money to help subsidize someone else's housing. And this really comes back to more of an issue that's probably another panel for another day, but is about who are these people and how do we as a community come together to support those in need? How do we put aside judgments? How do we see that getting people into stabilized housing actually benefits all of us in the long run? Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote, you might have read some of his books, Blink and Outliers, also wrote an article that you can look up online, I think it was in the New Yorker, called $1 Million Murray. And $1 Million Murray is about a true story about a homeless man in Reno, Nevada, who cost the city over $1 million because he was constantly getting into trouble. He was inebriated and falling down and getting injured, and they had put him in the hospital, and it cost the city of Reno over $1 million to take care of Murray. Whereas had Murray had housing, for $100,000, and probably even some case management on top of that, or let's even say maybe the case management is included, the city would have saved $900,000. So, you know, it makes sense. Now, that's a pretty simple way of illustrating the issue, but data shows that getting people into housing, stabilizing them in that housing, makes a long-term difference in their lives, and then in their children's lives. And pretty soon we start seeing those cycles of poverty break, and we see stability happen, and that improves. That's an improvement for everyone. All right, we have 5 minutes here left before we go to questions. Is that right, Judy? Am I on time? Okay, all right. I want to head down here to Chris for some final thoughts. Chris, how do we help? How do we make this happen? What can we do to help you build more units than just 500? Come on.
Well, I mean, first off, you don't have to, right? I mean, there are a lot of things that are causes for the housing program that are very easy. I said housing was easy, and I was corrected. You know, something as simple as ADUs, right? I mean, this is a relatively low-grade thing that was debated ad nauseum. I think a lot of people here might live in a neighborhood that is primarily single-family or at least low density. If every fourth house in one of these neighborhoods had an apartment over the garage or something like that, we would not have a housing problem. I mean, that's the reality of it. And so when you build something over the garage, is it going to go to someone who's, you know, paying $400 or $500 a month? Probably not. It's probably going to go to someone who might be paying $800 or $900 for that, or it just might be going to your kids when they're coming out of college, or someone who's returning to your family after, you know, maybe they're empty nesting or something like that. But the lack of those housing units is what the pressure for overall housing costs are responding to. And so having them in the market makes it so that the person who can afford $800 a month isn't taking the unit from the person who's $500, and it goes right up on the line. So I'm somewhat of an internal optimist. Like this is not an easy and simple thing to correct, but it absolutely is correctable. I mean, there are harder things that we have done as a nation, as a state, as a city, than figure out how to put roofs over the heads of our people. So I want to say that you don't have to figure out ways to build big buildings. You can just start with saying, well, all right, what are we doing right now that's preventing housing construction of any type? And realize that that prevention might be worse in reality than what perhaps the fear of it being in there. Someone having, you know, someone who makes a little bit less living on your street might be a better reality than having 1,100 people sleeping on the street right now. And so I think just mitigating the fears and realizing where some of this housing shortage is coming from helps a lot. Zoning's a big deal. And the reality is we have a ton of land. We have way more land than we need if we use it to house people slightly more dense. I mean, not a lot. I'm not talking about building apartment complexes in the avenues, although they're already there. We were really good at this back in the day. You can go into the avenues back when this state was founded, and you have a house right next to a mansion, right next to a multifamily building. And you found a lot more oneness back then because you had to see a neighbor as you walked out to get your milk that wasn't like you. And this is a little off topic, but I think a lot of the division in our state, our country, is directly proportionate to our ability to silo ourselves off, where I live in a community that looks just like me, that has the same economics of me, and then I get my news from a specific source. If you build communities that have a lot of people like the old school avenues that aren't like you, the reality of the us and them that we have going on right now kind of dissipates. It's a kind of an ancillary benefit to having housing equality. But the reality is these are very desirable places to live. You know, having you know, something above a garage is not going to tear down your neighborhood, and it may make it a lot better. Would be my suggestion. As far as kind of how to build larger scale projects, a lot of it is zoning. A lot of it is, you know, I mean, tax reform was a big hit. So voting for people that maybe think on a daily basis about how to help kind of lower income individuals definitely helps as well. And then when you see something come up on the docket on a state level, and there is Tara's running a bill right now, realize that that money is some of the best money you can spend for overall quality of life for your city, but also it's probably the most effective subsidy you can give people building a safety net in this community, which I think is really what it is. I mean, it's not so much that someone deserves help. You don't owe it to someone to help them pay their rent, but you've got to figure out what type of society do you feel really comfortable living in. Generally when I think of home, how does home treat people? And then you kind of realize that what you'd like to do is that if someone's working 40 hours and working their butt off, working 60 hours, doing everything they can, how bad do we want to let their life be? And that's kind of where you can figure out where your comfort level is on how much subsidy you might give in housing or any other thing, but specifically housing. And for me, I want someone, I want a mom who's working 2 jobs and has a kid on her knee to be able to go home and not worry that the place she lives is damaging her kid's health. And so when you see these sorts of bills come up on the legislature, I think supporting them is a huge thing we can all do.
Good, thank you. Nick, did you want to add
I
something?
was just going to add an example of what Chris was talking about with ADUs. So the city of Denver, they just barely, this is ongoing, two-day happening. They set a goal because they realized they could not fund their way out of their affordable housing issue. They needed the private sector to basically do it. They just set a goal citywide of having 10% of their single-family homes have an ADU in their property. And so that's, they're a typical block in Denver has 30 homes on it. That's 3 homes per block that would have an ADU. It's an accessory dwelling unit. So it's a mother-in-law, it's an apartment over a garage, it's a house along an alleyway, all of those things. And they are basically saying they can they can make it so they can address their housing needs simply by doing that.
Because it frees up. Is that why?
Well, it frees it up, but it also is the cheapest way to do it. So last year in California, the cost to build an affordable dwelling unit, a subsidized affordable dwelling unit, was over $300,000. The cost to build an ADU in LA was $140,000. So it's half the cost because there's generally not land costs associated with it.
Thank you to our panel. We have some questions.
So if you're like me, and I've heard some of this before, but I've been writing a lot of questions, because every time I hear the stories, I always have more questions. So I'm going to start with the first one. And you brought up the term accessory dwelling units, which is what Chris was talking about. But Salt Lake City, Cindy knows this, has been revising the accessory dwelling unit ordinance, I would bet, for 8 years. 7? 6, 9, a long time. 2014, only 4? Oh, I'll look at my file. It's very painful. So what could we do to get that off the dime?
Well, the good thing is so we basically, the city's planning division was asked by the council to relook at that ordinance. And we raised some red flags about how the ordinance that the council wanted to see adopted wasn't going to help us achieve our housing goals. And I think to the city council's credit, they recognized that and they asked us to go and fix it so that it can help us. We hopefully will sometime in March be having a follow-up discussion with the city council on what our findings of the analysis we've done and how our zoning ordinance impacts those types of things, because it's not just allowing them. It's, people don't realize this, but you can only have, regardless of the size of your lot in Salt Lake City, you can only have an accessory building that is 720 square feet maximum. So even if you have a 1 acre piece of property and it has a single family home on it, you get a 720 square feet maximum. And so those kinds of things are like, wait a minute, this is going to make it so these aren't doable. And so the council right now is going to, we're going to be discussing that with them in March, and hopefully they'll recognize that and make some changes to our code. It doesn't, not right now. We've kind of been waiting. There's a numbered but not developed bill at the state legislature that's called deregulation of tiny homes. We have no idea what it means. And so, because we haven't seen it, there's no language to it, so we don't know what it's happening or what the proposal is. I can't remember the name, but if you go to the new bills or the bills thing, it's just Google it, or not Google it, but just search in the state legislature, it'll pop up. So I doubt it would, but yeah.
But there are also some building code issues that have to change, right? In terms of if you want to build a tiny home on a foundation.
Well, the hardest part with the tiny home is connecting it to utilities. And so when they're a true tiny home on wheels and everything else, that connection, yeah, you can do things like composting toilets and things like that, but it's really that connection that makes it almost impossible to do it right. And so there have been people who have done it, who have tried it in Salt Lake City, and they will tell you that is the hardest part, is trying to figure out what to do with your wastewater. Because if you can't connect to the sewer, where do you put it? And so, yeah, but even they have to have their connections, each unit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's challenging.
I just want to add a couple things quickly. The ADU unit, part of the reason why it's taken so long is how it's really become such a divisive issue in the community. 2 council districts in one version prohibited any ADUs from being built in their community or in those districts. It wasn't until, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong because I actually wasn't there, but I heard that it was, there could have been some discrimination or some redlining type issues where you can't prohibit certain housing types because you're then prohibiting people. And that kind of caused some alarm, and people stepped back, and the council members said, oh, okay, no, we can have this. Okay, we'll have this discussion. But it's a real NIMBY issue. And when we did our open houses for the housing plan, I would have to say we had overwhelming support on most of the things in the housing plan except for the discussion about ADUs. And people came in and said, oh, well, if we build those, that'll bring college students. And if we have college students, that means cars and parties and there's a lot of fear and I think that's part of what has to happen in this, is that there needs to be a more informed discussion about ADUs and the benefit that they bring to a community. Final comment, and this is more just a funny story, and it's about Nick, but at the city, it's not about Nick personally, it's about his division at the city, but at the city at Halloween, this year they had a contest. They decorated doors in front of every division. It was spooky, and then they had to win and whoever would win, whoever had the scariest thing would win or whatever. When I saw Nick's in front of the planning division, I thought it was hilarious. They had this like skeleton in a suit or something, right? And he was holding the ADU ordinance. I just loved it. I thought it was so appropriate.
That's the best. So this is a 2-part question, and I'm going to ask the first one and then tell a little bit of a sugar house story. How can we create ownership opportunities with more density? So as the land use chair of the Sugar House Council, we have probably seen 6 or 7 4-plex condos, attached condos. And I would bet the cheapest one is going to go for $500,000. So ownership opportunities abound. So then the next one, it's not totally clear to me. How can the city or state mitigate lawsuits against new condo developments? Is that happening?
Okay. guess it probably depends on what the reason for the lawsuit is.
So back in the boom, there was a lot of lawyers who'd go out and work with these HOAs and get them really riled up about maybe defects or whatever, and then turn around and sue developers.
Yeah, I think, and I don't know about the extent of this, but one of the things that we're seeing in the city, and this causes problems for some condos, is that when they are and I think you've all seen them, this podium construction. So they've got 2 levels usually, or 1 level of concrete, and then wood frame above that. Is that over time, that wood framing shrinks, and it changes the legal description of the inside of condo units. And so it's the truth. but there's some the building technology is actually responding to that more. So the use of engineered wood doesn't have the same type of change over time. So one way to think about it is that if you had a wood frame construction, it can shrink up to, I think it's between 1/8 and 1/4 of an inch per floor. So if you have a 5-story building, that top, that there could be over 1 inch of difference over time just from the shrinking of that wood, and that causes obviously sheetrock applied to it, plumbing where you're drilling holes through walls and chases, and if those change, that might be some of that. There's also some insulation things that were causing some mold and things like that in the construction industry, but I don't know exactly if that's one of the things that's triggering some of those lawsuits or not, but those are some of the realities of the building world.
What happens when a voucher runs out, or are they permanent?
They're permanent. So part of the issue.
So none of the people can ever get a voucher once you give them all out?
Right. I mean, there's sort of income so right now the voucher system isn't designed to incentivize like economic advancement, right? So, and I don't mean that against the residents. If you have literally gone 15 years through evictions, hunger, trying to get your kids' shoes bought at the sacrifice of your rent check, by the time you get a voucher, you're not going to do anything to put that voucher in jeopardy, because that is your security. Now, there are some programs out there that are called family self-sufficiency programs, and they're really looking at how do we incentivize people moving away from the voucher system. And that looks like this, and it kind of gets to the home ownership question too. A portion of your rent is put away every month towards a down payment or towards some other asset development. And so what that allows people to do is acquire wealth. And so when we look at the investment we make, we have to think about not just how we're investing in the roof over people's head, but actual people. And are we setting them up for success? And so that's the way that the voucher systems work currently. If you make over, your voucher goes on. So if you're on a voucher system and maybe you get married and now with a dual income, you don't need that voucher anymore, it goes to somebody else. So there is some rotation, but primarily, to be honest, they're going to people who really need them. People on fixed income, people with mental and physical disabilities, people who can't work full time. And so those vouchers help them stay in their homes. Did that answer your question?
How much money is in the Salt Lake City Housing Trust Fund? How many units will that build, and how will the fund be renewed?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So currently we have about $4 million left. The fund wasn't used very frequently, actually, until I think Mike Ackerlow came into leadership and really did some advertisement around it and figured out how to get it used in our community. And then it started being used a lot, which was great, but now we're running out of money. So that's another problem. So we have about $4 million left, which will fund probably 4 to 5 projects. And that's just gap financing, and that will probably get us another couple hundred units. So not very much. It's a critical resource. I would say that a lot of times the Housing Trust Fund comes in and helps do the last dollars that a project needs to be funded, and we certainly need a sustainable source for it. So as we look at these options of a bond or a sales tax or anything, we look at how do we make this sustainable. These are loans primarily. It's very rare that we do anything that doesn't revolve back in, but it's patient. So that means our terms are 40 years, 35. And so it's certainly not a fund that's making a lot of money. It's just being replaced, and it's an investment worth continuing. No new money currently. So the RDA 21. So we received $3 million from the RDA and some of their affordable housing money. $1 million is targeted towards renovation pilot that will go through the Housing Trust Fund. But that was one-time funding. There is policy guidance for the RDA to look at a sustainable amount over the coming years, but generally, on average, we've received about $100,000 to $250,000 a year, which wouldn't be enough to support any type of project.
About 1 unit.
Yeah, yeah, it'll get me about a unit a year.
Are energy qualities of our construction adequately inspected?
So there's no requirement currently to do any type of energy efficiency. For city-owned dollars, we do require it. So if you're using city-owned dollars, then we look at it, and then that is validated through our permitting process. And it's a reimbursement basis. So, for example, if you do a LEED Gold project, you get expedited at the city, but not until you've proven that you've gotten that certification, and then it's reimbursed.
Any project that's using tax credits as well will both have to be Energy Star approved, and then they have to choose between Enterprise Green Communities or LEED of some level. And they do check that. If you are found to have not met one of those when you said you would, any money you've made off that project is ripped from you. So at least at the end of construction, definitely. And it's an important thing too, because you can control rent, but unless you somewhat control energy usage, if someone has 10 years from now, if they've got a $300 power bill, you haven't really given them affordable housing. So I can say at least for tax credit projects, they absolutely check. That's great.
Chris, do you know what energy code the state of Utah is operating under?
I mean, technically they're in one that's only a few years old,
Okay.
but it has so many carve-outs after the state legislature got out of it that it's really equivalent to about a 2006 code.
Yeah, that's what I was going to get at, is that the state of Utah adopts all of our building codes and tells cities what they can do in that regard. And so even though there may be better energy codes out there, we have to follow whatever the state tells us to follow. So, and we can't do any more than that.
Chris, what is the cost? What's the extra cost of doing energy efficiency?
Honestly, nothing. A lot of the things that are going to make your building more efficient pay themselves back in a year. So it's the time to decide you're going to do it, and having that be right at the forefront when you design. I mean, if you wanted to completely solar panel your building, that would cost a lot of money. But the difference between a resident who has an $80 a month utility bill and a resident who has a $50 a month utility bill usually is pennies to the developer. They just need to spend the time to do it.
One encouraging thing. Okay, doesn't the increased property value from well-maintained affordable housing start the cycle of unaffordable housing all over?
Oh, this is such a good question. I don't know who asked it, but so you'll hear a couple of things from communities. You'll hear affordable housing is going to bring crime, and I don't know, people, I don't know. They're very concerned about the type of person that's going to use affordable housing, felons and all of these things, and it's going to concentrate poverty. Affordable housing is going to concentrate poverty. And then you'll hear other aspects, and this also happens a lot with RDA, like, are you gentrifying a community by adding affordable housing to the project? And I would say that building communities is a very delicate balance. And it's really important that we work with communities to understand how to balance these issues. What I will say is that statistically speaking, affordable housing is the first thing to go in to help catalyze communities on their way towards higher property values. And it's important that it goes in first for a couple of reasons. One, because now we can't afford to put affordable housing in Sugar House. We lost that opportunity, right? It costs too much to build there to make it even feasible for taxpayer dollars to be used for that. You may all remember Simpson Avenue, and when the price for that purchase came out, the uproar that caused. And so we really have to consider what's actually available to purchase housing on. Because if we wait too long and we don't invest early in communities, one, I don't think we do the community any favors, because it can help with pedestrian on the streets. Those people can actually afford now to purchase in their communities, which means they can support local business. And you're stabilizing people that want to live in that community. And so I think it can do both, and that's a delicate thing that you have to balance as you go forward.
So when I started this discussion tonight, I said that affordable housing is one of the most complicated issues. And this is why, because we've talked tonight about zoning, we've talked about finance, we've talked about NIMBYism, we've talked about all these things, and we didn't even really touch on preservation. And preservation is keeping what's affordable in a community. And unfortunately, we see too many apartments or houses being turned over and losing that affordability. So there are tools that are available, but they're, again, really complicated, and they cost money. The city launched a community land trust, about a year ago or so, as a way to own property and allow, and to keep it, and so the city would own the property, the owner of the home would own the building above the ground. And it's very complicated. We won't get into it now, but it is a way for the city to help control that land value and therefore keep the affordability. So there are, and then the other ways to do it are for nonprofits or cities to go in there and to buy this housing and then use their funding and loan programs to help keep it affordable. But I remember Nick said to me, we were talking about gentrification a little while ago. So, gentrification is often such a bad word. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. It actually helps improve communities. What happens is it's bad when we don't take into account preservation and we talk about displacement. And if we don't do those things, then it is a bad thing for our community.
Would it be possible to zone out Airbnb?
It is possible. It's virtually impossible to enforce it. And so, and as an example of that, last year, the state legislature adopted a state code that says cities can't use online advertising for short-term rentals as part of enforcement. So we cannot use that as indication that somebody's using or running an Airbnb or VRBO or whatever. So without that, it's almost impossible for us to prove that someone's doing it without help from neighbors. Yeah, that's great. That's great. But then we have to prove it, right? And that when we can't use the online things, we can't do much about it. It's similar to the number of unrelated people living in a home. You know, we have to prove that someone's doing that someone has more than that number. And without that documentation, we can't really do much about it. And so even with the neighbors say, I know that there's more than, there's 5 unrelated people living there. Yeah, but how do we prove that those people aren't related, right? Yeah, but that doesn't prove that. I mean, the reality is that we can't force someone to show us their birth certificates. We can't force somebody to show us their ID, whether or not they're living in that home or not. You know, we can't do it. And so it's it's very, very difficult to enforce those kinds of regulations.
More questions
Mike touched on this when he brought up the notion of preservation, but what I hear is a lot of talk about new units of affordable housing, and I don't hear any energy going into protecting the existing units. In fact, we have an instance on Marikia in Salt Lake City where we're going to lose 3 two-bedroom, one-bath houses, which are highly desirable, and they will be replaced by very expensive townhomes. And those 3 two-bedroom, one-bath houses will never be replaced. So that is something that's just missing from the conversation that we have over and over again, is that these units of existing affordable housing are gone, and then if you look at the energy that it takes to replace them, or the impossibility of ever replacing them depending on their housing type, you know, we're just not paying enough, my point is we're not paying enough attention to that part.
I really appreciate that comment. In the housing plan, we talk about it, but it does lose the visibility that it needs. And frankly, you know, preservation can be much quicker and more efficient anyway. And so some of the things that we're doing in the city is we're really trying to look at our mitigation loss ordinance that Nick sort of alluded to earlier, is how do we ensure that as we lose these things as a city, we're enforcing something to replace them, especially when they're affordable, because in this market, that's exactly what's happening. And so it's such a critical issue, and you should definitely continue to bring it up now and in the future, because we get lost on the demand and the need for units, but frankly, we should just be helping people stabilize and improving current units as well. We have a lot of old housing stock that could use love, and so how do we do that? And then that doesn't displace people. So I appreciate your comments, and you should definitely keep saying that.
Instead of 3 years to build an apartment.
Yeah, and I think a really good example of that is in our RMF, our residential multifamily zoning districts, especially the smaller ones. There's been a lot of talk about changing the density requirements in there. We've been really hesitant to do that because we know it's going to displace those units. And we're already starting, it gets back to that luxury unit comment that I made. We're already seeing that. If all of a sudden we said, you know what, let's get rid of the density requirements in our RMF 35 zone. So this is kind of eastern downtown, there's some in Sugar House. You know, those units go away. And those older units are always going to be more affordable than new units that are going to replace them.
So Cindy, our organization is putting together right now an aggressive strategy to purchase smaller apartment complexes. We're looking at 50 units and below. We are also what's called a CDFI, which is a financial institution, and have access to a lot of capital that can do that. And so right now we are looking at that exact program because we see that as a great need, and it's hard when you drive around the city, you see these apartment buildings that are old and have a lot of, there's a good backbone there. They've just been run down. To see those then purchased, torn down, and replaced, yes, right, with some luxury townhomes or something. You know, when Melissa and I were working together, we often talked about, we felt like we were making such good progress on getting Housing Trust funding money out and building all these new units, and it was really exciting. And then we kept talking about, yeah, but look how many units we're losing in the city because of exactly this. And my bet is we're at a loss, that we are not getting ahead of the units that we need. So anyway, but just this is something our organization is working on right now in securing some funding and had a good, really, in fact, there's a meeting today on it of setting up some funding to help buy those types of units and preserving them.
I'd probably note too that the reason that the triplex gets torn down, like townhomes, is because they're not allowed elsewhere. I mean, property values are a function of density, and if you can't build townhomes anywhere but that triplex, then the value of the land, which is effectively what they're doing, they decided the land was worth more than the units. And the reason that land is that value is because we've cordoned off portions of the city. We're just like, no, this is only the density you can have. So you can have somewhat antithetical to where you think it would be. The way that you preserve existing housing stock is increasing density in places of way people they're moving here. They're moving here. They're going to live. We've got to give them places. We've got to give them places that are dense, that aren't these kind of great historic gems. Otherwise they're going to go away.
We had a comment over here.
I just want to say Lois Brown is smiling right now. Definitely.
That's great. Did you have a question?
I was just wondering, this is unrelated, but I have some good friends that are builders, really good builders, and high income builders, and they're just seeing that people aren't building anymore. People are not getting in the trades. People aren't doing it anymore. And people that go out and inspect homes and everything are just not getting in there anymore. And I'm wondering whether or not even a push for good craftsmen and people that actually want to do the work. There seems to be a need for people that want to work, and want to do, get, I don't know, pay, and things like that. And I don't know, it just seems like they're afraid that there's, that there's not going to be people that want to build anymore. And if they do want to build, they want to build big. They want to build something. He's building something that's 10,000, square feet. It's going to be in some magazine. And that's the way people are building now.
That's crazy.
I saw a piece on the news not too long ago, but it talked about these people or going into residential areas where people already lived or they were buying, and it was lower income people that would go in, and then they would want to get a loan to fix up some of their electricity problems and their utility problems, and they were having trouble getting their loans, and the people that were getting the loans were people who had more money and could come in and buy an old place and fix it up. And so it wasn't allowing the old residents the opportunity to keep their homes and to maintain them and make them better. Banks, I think, can be a big problem in helping people buy affordable housing and do what they want to do with it. Is that true?
So there are programs that are available. The city has a housing rehab program that are low interest loans, income restricted. So it's really for those who are lower income to get that financing to make those improvements. We also have some loan funds that we use to do the exact same thing. So
is that information available to people?
it is, but it's like anything. It's not always easy to find, right? I mean, you can put it out as much as you can, and not everybody sees it. So, I know Melissa's group does a lot of targeting. They look at all the income or the incomes in the different census tracts and the neighborhoods, and really try to reach out. And they do 110 probably loans a year. So the demand is certainly there. It's always hard to. It's not always easy to.
But to be clear, the bank should be using uniform standards for everybody, and it is illegal to not loan to somebody based on where they live. So it would need to be like a clear sort of rational reason not to loan on funds.
And I'll give a personal example, because when you started talking about 30% AMI, I'd never really done the math. So I've only been in my house 43 years. At the time, I was a newly divorced single mom. I was making $6,500 a year, and I was paying $300 a month for my mortgage. So I would qualify, and I applied for one of those, fix up the rest of the house. And I made too much money. So it's a great plan, but it doesn't work for everybody.
What can you say about this new large development on the old Granite School plot on 33rd South, 38th, 39th South on yeah, where? Just not far from here.
That's House Hall Lake.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be very high energy efficiency, which interests me. And I don't know what the other parameters are there.
I'm not sure. It's outside of Salt Lake City. proper limits. So we're very focused, sorry.
Last question.
Yeah, I was going to say, Garbet's building that, and their calling card is energy efficiency. Probably the best in the state for single-family home energy efficiency.
Yeah. Do we know the other qualities of it, or density, or?
You know, I wish I did, but it's not being very public. And not to cast aspersions on them, it's just not quite in their marketing cycle where it's beneficial for them to make it very public.
It'll come out again.
So a lot of what we've talked about has been very focused at the city level, but we've also talked about how this isn't just a Salt Lake City problem. In the past 2 or 3 sessions, the legislature's done a bit, right? They've allowed areas where their RDA is not effectively using the section of funds set aside for affordable housing creation. They've allowed them to throw that into the Olin Walker Trust Fund or give it to another RDA somewhere in the state because they don't really want to spend it. This session, there's a bill up to essentially penalize communities where they have a lower than average affordable housing stock and then match those funds with state money. Are there other ways we as the league can be keeping an eye on state level policy in order to best support the work at the local level?
Those are all good points.
Points you bring up. I think, as I wish Tara were still here because she's our expert up at the Hill. But there is talk about this $100 million bond, which may not happen this year, but at least lays the groundwork for something like that. I think one thing to keep in mind is we talk about communities who are willing to pass off money to other communities. It comes back to Melissa's point earlier that certain cities shouldn't be responsible for all the affordable housing. This needs to be spread across. Every community needs it. People want to live in the neighborhood where they grew up. And so every city needs to take its fair share. And I think sometimes what happens is we allow people or these cities to just we let them sleep at night because they put their money in a fund. And we would like to see more cities have accountability and to provide for their residents. So I think as these discussions come up and you talk about some of these bills that are going through, it would be great to have a voice saying that's not acceptable. Every city needs to house every resident
That wants to live there.
Can't we do a marketing something? Can't we, marketing sells everything. What's wrong with this? Why can't we do that?
I think it's a good idea.
Really, that's how things get sold.
Yeah, I think it's needed.
Really. And you said education, that education is marketing. Marketing's education. Of course, it might not go.
And I would say also there's quite a bit of power in this room and every person that you talk to. This is a group of, 35.
Road home people can't go anywhere. They don't have no place to go, and they need help. They need to learn how to train, how to work, how to change their minds about working. They have no place to go.
Yeah.
And then there's the other people that are just making it.
Yeah, agreed.
Who cares about them?
Yeah.
Who does? And we're giving money back to
One quick comment on the local kind of politics too. One of the things that happened during this last election cycle, and particularly in southern Salt Lake County, is that there was a voter reaction to high density housing being built in those communities. And the mayor of Sandy, I think Harriman, Riverton, some council people ran and won on no more housing. And so that's, the side effect of that is that the legislature is going to basically come out, not this year, but maybe next year and year after that, and tell cities you have to allow this. This is in California right now. They're dealing with a statewide bill around their transit centers, their light rail stations and things like that, that basically is removing local government's ability to regulate land use. And so just do whatever, if you're gonna build housing at transit, you could do whatever you want. And when you have a legislature that's very development driven, even though it's coming out of California, you can, the writing's gonna be on the wall.
I think too, we humans have a bad habit of showing up for things we hate politically. Like, if there's a bill I want to sink down, I'm going to show up. But I don't know, Housewives is on the bills I really think are good, and I'll show up with. Basically, we don't show up unless we're angry. And I think the people in this room, most planning meetings I've ever been to in my life have a fifth of the people here. I mean, that are actual yes or no. And they're almost always no. And so I think part of the reason we have the policies we do, especially in these more suburban cities, is because people that do care that their best reality includes a place in their city where everybody gets to live, they're not there when that mayor is campaigning. They're not there in that planning meeting where they're going to rip away higher density zoning, because it didn't call to them in the same way of something that they were negative about. So if everybody here just had an idea where, 3 times a year I'm going to show up to a planning meeting and tell them I'd really like some zoning, the effect of that is massive. I mean, 2 or 3 people have swayed $100 million developments. It happens all the time. And those 2 or 3 people are almost always negative, even though the whole community might have agreed with it. So I just don't underestimate. You guys, this is great. Seeing this many people interested in voting. I mean, the whole concept behind this group is amazing. And I think people greatly underestimate the power that just this room collectively could have. So please go out, and the next time whatever city to be named is considering downzoning a place or not including more density in an area that's just warehouses right now usually, let them know. Just say, look, my best world, my city's best world involves a place where everybody gets to live.
Let me just add on quickly. I don't know how you distribute your information to your group, but it would be good to have Tara send out an update on the 3 bills, because the 3 bills right now are the Housing Commission, the $100 million bond, and then I don't remember the third one very well, but it's something about this requirement that cities have to report or something how much moderate income housing they're providing. Anyway, if she sends out the information, it'd be good for you to see it and then contact whoever you need to contact. And yeah. Well, and there's an opportunity. I mean, I went up yesterday to the Capitol and testified on the Housing Commission bill, and there's an opportunity for the public to go in front of these committees and testify. And I think that's, even though they're all looking at their phones, it is important to get there.